Mars human colony. This is how many people you need to colonize Mars according to scientists. So you want to colonize Mars? Well, Mars is a long ways away, and in order for a colony to function that far from earthly support, things have to be thought out very carefully, including how many people are needed to make this thing work. We know it's the fourth planet from our sun. This is by even Go Universe Today's on Science Alert. The new study pegs the minimum number of settlers have to be at least 110. The new study is titled Minimum Number of Settlers for Survival on Another Planet. The author is Jean-Marc Salotti, professor at Bordeaux Institute, National Polytechnic in France. His paper is published in Scientific Reports. Obviously, there's a lot to think about when it comes to having any kind of sustained presence of another planet, and how will people organize themselves? What equipment will they bring? How will they extract in situ resources? And what kinds of skills are needed? These questions have been addressed before, and in this report, Salotti says that the use of in situ resources and different social organizations have been proposed, but there is still a poor understanding of the problem's variables. This study mostly focuses on one question: how many people will it take? And Salotti says, I show here that a mathematical model can be used to determine the minimum number of settlers and the way of life for survival on another planet, using Mars as an example. A lot of thought has gone into colonizing Mars. SpaceX says their proposed interplanetary spacecraft could carry 100 people to Mars. Elon Musk has talked about building a fleet of them, so that there is a constant flow of resources to Mars. But is that realistic? Salotti writes, however, this is an optimistic estimate of the capability. The feasibility of the reusability remains uncertain, and the qualification of the vehicle for landing on Mars and relaunching from Mars could be very difficult and take several decades to do that. A similar dynamic hovers over other parts of Mars colony discussion. Many researchers have thought about the in situ resource utilization, for instance. Gases could be extracted from the atmosphere and minerals from the soil. In situ resource extraction could provide organic compounds like iron and even glass. Even if we grant the feasibility of these ideas, the complexity of the implementation is poorly understood, and the number of items that would remain to be sent each year would still represent a tremendous challenge. This is what Salotti reveals. The problem of a colony is bewilderingly complex. Salotti worked on the mathematical model that he thinks could serve as a good starting point for thinking about a self-sustaining colony. Central to his idea is what he calls the sharing factor, which allows some reduction of time requirements per individual. If, for example, the activity concerns the construction of an object that can be shared by several individuals. The starting point of the settlement is critical to the rest of the work. What resources will be in place? If there's a large amount of resources and technological tools in the beginning, that will affect the rest of the calculations. But in some ways, the starting point might not be as critical for two factors. The complexity, expense, and feasibility of interplanetary travel is one, and the lifetime of the equipment that settlers start with is another. Every piece of equipment has a lifetime. For the sake of simplicity, Salotti writes, it's assumed here that the initial amount of resources and tools sent from Earth will be rather limited, and as a consequence will not have much impact on survival. In essence, building a model that relies on easy resupply from Earth would not be that helpful. So granting that the initial state of the colony is viable, Salotti moves on to two variables which have a huge effect on survival. The availability of local resources, basically this means water, oxygen, and chemical elements. Those resources have to be easy to exploit, and there is no water and no oxygen, as we know. Now, production capacity. Think of it as a list of things that have to be produced, like tools, and if enough of them can be produced in the appropriate time frame. What Salotti is working up to here is an equation. Things like resource availability and production capacity are variables in that equation. But Salotti's idea always circles back to the concept of the sharing factor. Imagine an isolated individual in a colonizing situation on Mars. They would have to perform all tasks themselves. They would need to build and or maintain their own systems to acquire drinking water, oxygen, and to generate power. There would not be enough time in each day. The burden on the single person would be enormous. But in a larger colony, their technology for things like getting drinking water, oxygen, and for generating power is used by more people, and that creates more demand, but it also spreads out the burden. The effort it takes to build and maintain all these systems is now spread out among more people, and that, in essence, is Saloti's sharing factor, and it gets better. As the number of people increases, there's room for more specialization. Imagine a colony of only 10 people. How many of them would need to be able to repair and maintain the drinking water system or the oxygen system? Those systems cannot be allowed to fail, so there would be pressure for a large percent of those people to be able to operate and understand those systems, of course. And Saloti writes, if each settler was completely isolated and no sharing was possible, each individual would have to perform all activities, and the total time required would be obtained by a multiplication by the number of individuals. But if there are 100 people, how many people need to understand those systems? Not everyone. So that allows others to specialize in something else. Yeah, well, I would say that the fundamental things that you need, everybody should understand how to extract them. You can't specialize in something else. There are basic things, fundamental things that you have to be able to do, to know how to do. That's my opinion. And anyway, he goes on to say here, a greater number of individuals make it possible to be more efficient through specialization and to implement other industries, allowing the use of more efficient tools. Saloti argues that this sharing factor can be calculated and estimated with different mathematical functions. Math-interested people can check that part out in the paper for themselves. There are some constraints and starting points for the sharing factor. Of course, the sharing factor depends on the needs, the processes, the resources, and the environmental conditions, which may be different depending on the planet. This leads us to Saloti's description of survival domains. Saloti outlines 5 domains that need to be considered in these calculations: ecosystem management, energy production, industry, buildings, human factors, social activities. These are mostly self-explanatory, but some factors refer to things like raising the education of children's education, and some amounts of cultural activities like sports, games, and perhaps music. Now Saloti turns to Mars, the primary planet when it comes to this kind of futuristic figuring, and the planet that Saloti addressed in his paper. Saloti does not start from scratch when it comes to Mars, and there's already been a lot of scientific thinking into building a sustained human presence on the planet. The specific utilization of Martian resources for life support, agriculture, and industrial production has been studied in different workshops and published in reports and books. Obviously, this is a complex problem, and some assumptions have to be made in order to think about it. For any solution to have merit, those assumptions have to be honest. No place for science fiction here. The basic assumption Saloti uses is that, for whatever reason, the flow of supplies from Earth has been interrupted, and the colony must sustain itself. He borrows a scenario from a contest organized by the Mars Society, where participants were asked to define a realistic scenario for setting Mars. Basically, Saloti's equation comes down to time. How much time is required for survival versus how much time is available? For Saloti, the effective number of people required to balance the time equation is 110 on Mars. He writes in the conclusion, it's based on the comparison between the required working time to fulfill all the needs for survival and the working time capacity of the individuals. Naturally, work of this nature makes some assumptions which are spelling out in the paper. They're spelled out in the paper. This is obviously a rough estimate with numerous assumptions and uncertainties, he says, but that does not diminish its usefulness. If there's ever going to be a human colony on Mars at some point in the future, then we need to develop working models to guide our thinking and our planning. We have a lot of sci-fi talk and flowery announcements for people like with large Twitter followings, but that's not real work. To our knowledge, it is nevertheless the first quantitative assessment of the minimum number of individuals for survival based on engineering constraints, he says. Our method allows simple comparisons, opening the debate for the best strategy for survival and the best place to succeed. This was originally published on Universe Today, and it's on Science Alert. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.